What you're looking at now is footage from the capital city of one of the two countries of Europe that are allegedly Muslim majority. Yet everywhere you look, it just doesn't feel like it is one. In 2 weeks in Albania, I saw fewer headscarves than in 3 hours in Budapest, and Islam is really rare in Budapest to begin with. In 2 weeks in Albania, I only heard one Islamic call to prayer, even though I lived in what is supposed to be the most Islamic neighborhood in Tirana, and although I tried, I could not find an open mosque to visit and videotape inside. Well, for starters, there aren't that many mosques to begin with, but the few that do exist are either rarely opened or closed for a longer period of time for various reasons, most common being construction work and, get this, chronic lack of attendees. This is the quote-unquote Muslim country where boys are not genitally mutilated, apostasy is common and unremarkable, and interfaith marriages are so unremarkable that nobody really knows how many do exist, but everyone can point out to a Muslim neighbor who converted to Orthodoxy to marry a Catholic. It goes without saying that such thing as public sex segregation is literally unheard of in Albania, and every Albanian I asked about things like modesty dress codes simply burst into laughter regarding the idea as utterly absurd. This is also the quote-unquote Muslim country where Jews found solid refuge during World War II, the country finishing the war with more Jews than it started it. All Jews living within Albanian borders during the German occupation, those of Albanian origins and refugees alike, were saved except members of a single family. Consequently, Albania maintains a strong relationship with Israel to this day, to such an extent that there is such thing called the Albanian-Israel Chamber of Commerce, and it is a matter of routine to meet Israeli citizens on the streets of Tirana. Most of these things are completely unimaginable in most of the other Muslim-majority countries, perhaps with the exception of Northern Cyprus, and not by accident. So, what makes Albania different? Let's explore! Hello everyone and welcome to the first featured installment of the 2018 Albania tour. We'll kickstart this series with the elephant in the room, religion in Albania. How come Albania looks and feels entirely different in virtually all respects when compared to any other Sunni majority country? Some have speculated that it's because Muslims represent only about 60% of the country, or 58.79% if we are to believe the 2011 census, which we really shouldn't, but more on that later. But that speculation alone is easily contradicted by the example of the Bosnia-Herzegovina Federation, where Muslims are 51% of the country and the place is more Islamic in many ways than Albania is today and probably ever was. One day, hopefully, I'll get to show you Bosnia as well. So it's not the prevalence, it's something else. Something within the Albanian society and within Muslims themselves that simply functions differently. To understand this question, we first need to get back to history and get at least a cursory glance on how the Albanian society used to function and what are the foundations of the modern Albanian society. As one might suspect, it has little to do with Islam. Exploring this requires a bit more digging, which is fine because you get to see more footage from this country. So, for the purposes of this talk, the presentation is divided as follows. 1. Geography. 2. Religion before the Ottoman Empire. 3. The Ottoman period. 4. The brief independence. 5. The communist period. 6. The post-communist period and present day. And finally, number 7. Conclusions. As it is the case with many political topics, and religion is a political topic, there are factors that are immutable and do determine outcomes regardless of the ideas of those who build or attempt to build those said outcomes. Geography is one such immutable characteristic. When it comes to religion, the geography of Albania presented quite a challenge for whomever tried to influence the religious landscape in this part of Europe. The mountains you're seeing as the plane descends towards the Mother Teresa airport in Tirana were both the angels and the demons for the Albanian people. Angels when the rulers forgot to think about the mountains, and demons when the rulers were smarter. Up until about 10 years ago, when Albania started building its road network to the extent that now Albania has some of the finest roads in Europe, the mountains were basically there be dragons territory. From the 1st century Anno Domini and almost till present day, anyone who wanted to spread that idea, including religious ideas, in Albania had to contend with the fact that the mountains would prevent them from efficiently spreading that idea, thus leaving room for a lot of enclaves of previous ideas, some syncretism here and there, and, as I said earlier, plenty of there be dragons territory. This prevented the 10% rule from playing out in terms of religion when the Catholics tried to replace the Orthodox Christianity, then when the Ottoman Empire tried to replace Christianity, and later on when the Communists tried to replace all religion. But more on that later. The point that one needs to keep in mind about geography in the context of religion in Albania is that the mountainous terrain makes the analysis far more complicated than it is for flatter countries. On top of that, the harsh terrain made it impossible for stable urban centers to emerge in most of the country for centuries, which means significant portions of the Albanian population have rarely, if ever, been influenced by whatever schools of thought developed in the urban centers between the 1st century AD and late 19th century. Now, that's not to say urban centers did not exist. Of course they did. But their influence on the rest of the country was marginal most of the time, precisely because traveling was particularly difficult even when compared to Albania's immediate neighbors, such as modern-day Macedonia or modern-day Montenegro, whose terrain is significantly easier as it can be seen on any map. So keep that in mind as we proceed throughout this video, because most of the things I will say in the following minutes must be understood as somewhat relative or, roughly speaking, precisely because of this geographical aspect. So, let's get to number 2. Religion before the Ottoman Empire. Albania, or for a while Illyricum, is one of the few places that had radical changes of its religious landscape more than once, while most of Europe did not get through this, as the later religious wars were fought mostly politically and less religiously. St. Paul says in the Bible at Romans 15:19 that, quote, "through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about unto Illyricum I have fully preached the gospel of Christ." End quote. So it is safe to say that the first contact with organized monotheistic and Abrahamic religion in these lands was with Christianity, with St. Paul himself, particularly in this area you're watching footage from right now, namely Shkodra in northern Albania. With that said, Christianity started really spreading towards the end of the 3rd century, although Christian thought was already quite developed, or developed enough, that Christian bishops from here attended the First Council of Nicaea. Due to its geographical location, the Albanian lands always had a duality of influences, as both Latin and Greek influences manifested heavily throughout the centuries. One early evidence of this duality is noticed in the period of over 3 centuries between the 4th century and the 8th century, when this area was in the fold of the Byzantium but under the jurisdiction of the Roman Pope. This duality was de jure broken in 732 when the Byzantine emperor detached the Church of the Promise from the Roman Pope and placed it under the Patriarch of Constantinople, infuriated because the local clerics backed Rome on the iconoclastic controversy. Long story. The duality, though, continued for many centuries, even after the 1054 Great Schism, which formally divided the place into the Catholic North and the Orthodox South. Mind you, this division was still only in the eyes of the churches for administrative purposes, although these divisions soon seeped into the political realm as well, since around the 11th century the first attempts to create an Albanian kingdom also occur. Things were further complicated by what is known in the international historiography as the Fourth Crusade. Long story short, the Western Catholics attacked and sacked the city of Constantinople and created a ton of problems all over the Byzantine world, including Albania, problems that would then take decades to solve but were not solved fast enough and thus paved the way for the Ottomans to advance. As I said, very long story. But the point is that these complications had a ripple effect in Albania. Instead of focusing on building the kingdom, enough energy was being spent on converting and reconverting dioceses from Orthodox to Catholic and vice versa, complications that delayed the appearance of the First Kingdom of Albania till late 13th century. The rise of the Albanian kingdom saw the Catholics win politically, but again, geography also saw de facto duality of Orthodoxy and Catholicism playing out in real time in ways that neither Byzantine ideologues nor Roman ideologues could really understand. In Durrës, for instance, de facto Catholic-Orthodox duality persisted way into the 14th century, even as the official story of the Vatican said that the previous Orthodox autocephalous Archbishopric of Ohrid had already been dismantled and replaced with the Catholic Rite. This period is also of relevance because this is when Christian scholars note the Albanian language as distinct from Latin but still compatible with the Latin script, an aspect which remained consistent to this day. You know what else remained consistent to this day in Albania? Being accustomed as a society to see religious duality. So, let's go to number 3, the Ottoman period, which stretches from late 14th century and until 1912, a period almost as long as the struggle between the Catholics and the Orthodox, and also a period that saw the second radical religious transformation in the Albanian ethno-linguistic area. Now, the Ottoman period, as it pertains to Albania, is quite fascinating because there are a few episodes that speak both to the way Islam always tried to spread and why things worked out differently here than in other places. So, First things first. The territory of modern-day Albania falls under Ottoman rule around the year 1480, and for more than a century, Islam remained a marginal phenomenon in Albania, in the sense that most of the populace was still mostly Catholic and Orthodox, but the elite was rapidly converting to Islam based on the tax policies and other incentives offered by the Sultan, who was interested in co-opting the aristocracy. One of the co-opted aristocracy was a man named George Kastrioti, or Skender Bey, a man who would become the symbol of Albania so big that not even the all-powerful gulag-wielding communists dared to question. Kastrioti, or Skanderberg in English, converted to Islam in his youth, as he was, like many other sons of aristocrats, sent to the Sultan's court to be educated as a de facto hostage. Many sons of those in the former Greek aristocracy had the same fate, as well as later on the sons of aristocrats in modern-day Bulgaria, modern-day Romania, modern-day Hungary, and so on and so forth. Skanderberg, though, chose to remain in the empire and rose through the ranks and dutifully served the Ottoman Empire for 20 years until he decided he has had enough. Skanderberg, for instance, was one of the high-ranking officials that sabotaged the Ottoman Empire in what international history calls the Defense of Belgrade of 1456, where the Christian forces were led by a character my fellow countrymen know very well, namely Hunjad János, or Janko de Hunedoara, still revered to this day in Hungary, Romania, Serbia, and even Bulgaria for some reason. Anyway, sometime in 1443, Skanderberg decides he's had enough and starts double-crossing the Ottoman Empire, cutting deals with Christian powers, and he himself converts back to Christianity, and until the end of his life, he never stops harassing the Ottoman Empire and using his wealth and strength to subvert and divert the Ottomans. In his fiefdom, Skanderberg also forced everyone to convert back to Christianity, and until his death in 1468, he was one of those stubborn ones who resisted the spread of Islam in what is today northern Albania. To this day, the north is mostly Catholic, particularly the villages which are set on impossible terrain even by modern standards. Good luck changing the religious landscape here, where everyone else failed. The Ottomans' own census data in the 16th century show that Islam was no more than 5% of the country, and these numbers remained unchanged for another century or so. But this period is also important for another reason. It is the period when the populace develops several, let's call them syncretic practices, for lack of a better word. Basically, religion becomes an admixture of pre-Christian pagan rites, some Catholic or Orthodox habits, and a sort of Muslimish outward appearance. That something is still quite common to this day, especially in the countryside, and it's something that would require deep study by someone more competent than me, and someone with more time and interest than me in religious syncretism in general. The short point that is of relevance is that these practices slowly developed in an almost unique fashion in this space, paved the way for this area to accept much more widely the mystic Islamic order called the Bektashi. Now, the Bektashi are to the Muslim world what the Episcopals, or more likely the Society for Independent Christian Ministry, are for the Christian world. The Bektashi don't believe mosques should really exist, don't believe the Quran is meant to be taken literally, have little to no use for the hadiths, and eat pork and drink alcohol. Oh, and they make great alcoholic beverages, but that's a story for another day. We'll get back to the Bektashi towards the end of this video, but it's important to note that their practices started really taking root in Albania around the 16th century. Now, the Ottoman period is marked by a much more aggressive Islamization process after the 17th century. Not surprisingly, for those aware of how Islam works and of the 10% rule, the fastest area to be Islamized was the central part of Albania, which consists mostly of plains and had all the trade routes going through there. But the Orthodox South and the Catholic North gave the Ottomans quite a run for their money. The instances of sabotage were so often that the Sultan at one point outright banned Albanian Muslims from bearing arms due to the multitude of instances where Albanians would convert to Islam just to get weapons and then see those weapons used against the Ottoman authorities. In the north, important portions of the male population would nominally convert to Islam so they could get weapons, but then married Catholic women and practiced Catholicism or no religion at all. In the south, conversions to Bektashi became quite common because the Bektashi didn't ask for any observance and would also not put one in trouble with the Ottoman administration. Long story short, the Albanians really did not want Islam. And the more Albanians resisted, the more the empire doubled down with the Islamization efforts, to such an extent that the empire worked more to reach 50% in Albania than anywhere else in Dar al-Harb. To put it in perspective, the empire barely moved a finger to reach 50% in Bosnia, and by 17th century the empire had 100% of the urban centers. And while the empire was trying hard, the non-Muslim elite in Albania was starting to think about national independence, prominent for the period being Pietro Bogdano, who advocated for an Albanian outside of the Ottoman Empire and put his money where his mouth was and raised an army to support Austria against the Ottoman Empire. He failed his attempt, but as we always say on this channel, ideas have consequences. And Bogdani's ideas had severe consequences almost 2 centuries later. At the end of the Ottoman period, Islam had a 51% majority or a 47% plurality, depending on which sources you trust. 400 years worked the Ottoman Empire and failed miserably, just like the militant Crusader Catholic had worked for 400 years to turn the place fully Catholic and failed. As I was mentioning Bogdani's ideas earlier, his ideas were disseminated in the Bektashi tekes in the south and the Catholic churches in the north, and suddenly religious tolerance became an Albanian nationalist policy toward the end of the 19th century, as Albanian intellectuals were looking around and seeing that every other formerly Christian state was declaring independence. So, let's speak about the brief independence in point number 4. Albania gains independence in 1912 based on a set of circumstances that are quite outside the scope of this talk, but the shortest way I can put it is like this. The Second Balkan War was happening, the Ottoman Empire was weak, and a very smart statesman named Ismail Cemali correctly observed that there is a vacuum of power that should be seized. So, with Austrian support, he gathers a national assembly in Vlora and proclaims the independence, which is recognized a few months later in London, partly due to the immense efforts of the Albanian diaspora, which was, at the time, just as big and strong as it is today. Some more occupation happens, but by the end of 1913, Albania emerges as an independent state with a map identical to the one of today. During this brief independence, which lasted until the occupation of Albania by the fascists in 1939, and by fascists I mean that in the most strict sense possible, since it was the creator of fascism himself, Benito Mussolini, who ordered the occupation. So during this brief independence, the elite got its first shot at trying out its ideas. World War I happens, with many Albanians fighting as volunteers for Austria, since Albania was an Austrian protectorate, and then, after the war, a both literally and figuratively Game of Thrones starts at the top of the newly independent Albanian nation. One of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence, Ahmet Muhtar Zogoli, comes to prominence and quickly raises through the ranks to become Prime Minister, then President, and eventually proclaims himself King Zog I, King of the Albanians, in 1928. Prior to 1922, Albania was formerly led by some European prince that nobody cares about, since that period didn't quite work out well. Obviously, the story is more complex, but you get the point. King Zog, however, brings in the idea that the state should be neutral when it comes to religion, that religious practice should be free to all faiths, and most important, that it would be preferable for the religion of Albanians to be Albanianism. And no, I'm not joking, and yes, this idea is still being widely held to this day. Also, under King Zog, who was still the prime minister at the time, the Albanian Muslim Congress is pressured to formally break away with the caliphate and also establish a new form of prayer, done while standing in contrast with most of the Muslim world to this day. Also, in the same Congress in 1923, all other remains of Muslim rules are abolished, such as hijabs, polygamy, and other customs. Soon after, the Albanian Orthodox Church obtains autocephalous status, and the king also marries a Christian princess. The monarchy also influences the press, which from 1930 onwards starts to disparage the use of overtly religious Christian or Muslim names, advising people to start using generic ethnic Albanian names. Reverend Edwin Jacques, a Baptist missionary in that period, writes in his book The Albanians that the monarchy also took great care to spread propaganda with messages like "We are no longer Muslim, Orthodox or Catholic, we are all Albanians," or quite overt ones like "Our religion is Albanianism." With such a population that was still technologically backwards and so many things to do in terms of modernizing the country, King Zog's governments regarded religious tolerance as not just the moral position to take, but also the only expedient position to take, a view which is reflected to this day in Albania and a view which can be seen in Albanian thinkers before the 20th century as well. Some authors have speculated that this is basically because the Ottoman Empire arrived, a large chunk of the population did not really hold any serious religious conviction. I'm not entirely convinced by that, but it is a view worth considering. Alright, now let's get straight to the communist period, because the World War II period is basically like the 1930s, since the fascist administration did not seriously meddle with the religious affairs. But the commies did. Quite a lot. In the words of the political prisoner with whom I spoke in Shkodra, we didn't want fascism in Albania either, but fascists left us alone to live our lives in peace. The commies wanted to dictate even to whom we pray to. And by that he meant the commies had no intention of even pretending to maintain the arrangement of the previous generation. With great pride, the communists led by Enver Hoxha declared Albania to be the first, and so far the only, officially atheist country in the world. This meant in practice that religion was no longer irrelevant or marginal for the state. It didn't even mean it was marginalized like it was in other communist states, but officially something that needs to be gotten rid of. More than 2,000 religious institutions, mostly mosques and Orthodox churches and monasteries, but also Catholic churches and other places of worship, were torn apart and the clerics killed or tortured for decades in the labor camps which officially didn't exist. Thousands upon thousands of people were employed by the secret police, the Sigurimi, solely for the purpose of surveillance of potentially dangerous elements, which invariably included all former clerics and individuals who manifested any form of religious observance, but also individuals who were perhaps once seen as having attended religious service, and of course individuals who had relatives abroad. If that relative was religious, it was a foregone conclusion that you'd be on the Sigurimi's list. The official narrative was that the Orthodox Christians are basically Titoist apes, and yes, that was the terminology used in propaganda films. The Catholics are basically agents of the Anglo-American imperialists through the Pope, and the Muslims were also agents of the imperialists since they were, according to the regime, following the faith of the NATO member Turkish Republic. The level of religious repression of this period far outstrips the persecution exerted by the Ottoman Empire against Christians or any other religion-based persecution exerted in the previous 1,000 years in the Albanian space. Still, Even the commies had to face geography, religion surviving mostly in the mountainous areas as well as more northern coastal areas which could easily receive Italian TV and radio signal. The radio signal was far more important than the broadcasters themselves ever imagined, as Albanian Catholic dissidents set up a radio station in Italy to broadcast religious content as well as free news in Albanian. For decades, these dissidents broadcasted under the assumption that essentially nobody is listening. But people did listen, to the extent that Sigurimi agents turned against the regime and large swaths of the more coastal population either retained their faith or discovered it. Many of those ended up being part of the demise of the regime decades later. But besides these stories, the communist period is marked by a much more successful campaign of suppressing religion, and although after the regime fell, not many people declared themselves atheists per se, the number of people with no religion or with a de facto atheist view ended up being quite high and remains high to this day. So we're now at point number 6, the post-communist period and present day. Normally, I could have started the video from here, but if I had done that, most of what I'm about to say would have made no sense whatsoever. Because there is no way one can even begin to scratch the surface on the religious affairs of this country without having at least a minimal understanding of how this country came to be this way. So, after Ottoman rule, brief secular modernism in the interbellum, and then militant suppressive atheism from 1945 till 1991, Albania today is different. And it's not only different when compared to other allegedly Muslim-majority countries, but it's different in all respects. Even when compared to the ethnically similar Kosovo, it is still different. Kosovars are far more religious and different in many regards from the Albanians in the Albanian Republic. Geography played a role in their development as well. Hopefully, some other time, I'll get to show you Kosovo as well. But basically, after the fall of communism, religion did not have an overnight full return into the public life like it happened in other post-communist countries, notably Poland and Romania, but rather a more gradual return. This, of course, happened also because of economic constraints. The communist regime was far more atrocious in every respect than any other communist regime anywhere else in the Intermarium region, the level of poverty that could be observed in the early 1990s being much more stringent than anywhere else. Also, unlike other places, here the religious institutions were physically removed, both the buildings themselves and the clerics, so the challenge was far more complex than in other places. While, let's say, Ukrainian or Polish parishes were trying to raise funds in order to renovate their churches, which had been left to decay under communism, in Albania there was no parish to begin with, and no church to begin with. Once again, though, the expedience of religious tolerance prevailed, so unlike other areas, such as modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina, the religious folk turned back to peaceful life and cooperation. With no Sigurimi to be afraid of, multiple places saw events that are otherwise thought of as impossible in the modern era, such as Muslims raising funds to build a new church to replace the one demolished by the commies, or the Catholics raising funds to fix the mosque that was partially demolished by the commies. And this phenomenon was not rare, but normative. Whether by design or by accident, most of the nominal Muslims today in Albania are either non-practicing or part of the Bektashi order, which, as explained earlier, is basically people who say they're Muslims, and that's pretty much it. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned northern Cyprus as the only other place where things sort of resemble the situation in Albania, and I said that's not by accident. If you remember from my video from Cyprus, I showed you then the Mevlevi Teke, which was the house of the Mevlevi order until the 1960s. The Mevlevi order is, just like the Bektashi, a dervish type of order. It seems that wherever these types of dervish orders emerge, the outcome resembles something that we'd call civilization rather than the barbarism that tends to occur when more, let's call them mainstream versions of Sunni or Shia end up being dominant. According to a professor of religious studies in Tirana that I spoke with and who did not want to appear on the camera, only about 2% of the Albanian population is what he called conservative Muslims, and most of those are either very old or Kosovars who, for one reason or another, chose to move permanently to Albania. I tend to agree with the fine professor, since no matter how much I tried for over 2 weeks, I couldn't find a single so-called conservative Muslims to speak with either on camera or off camera. Just when I thought I hit the jackpot when I met a man who insisted to tell me he's a Muslim, I was soon disappointed because when I asked him about the mosque in central Tirana, which is now closed, he couldn't tell me anything about it. In his words, "Oh, that mosque. I really don't know why they had to close it down. I should know because I'm a Muslim, but I don't since I haven't stepped into a mosque in the last 20 years, close quote. And I've had this conversation 100 times in 2 weeks in Albania. Christians are a bit more active. I've encountered missionaries from various Protestant cults, some of them I had no idea they even exist, and even caught on tape an evening mass at the Orthodox Cathedral, but still, even there, the attendance is low, except the Easter period, when it's obviously higher. But as one Orthodox priest explained to me, the attendance may indeed be low now, but in 1992 it was literally zero. So I guess in that comparison, things aren't really that bad. In the current year, the notion of religious hatred is completely alien to Albanians, and while it didn't quite happen during the reign of King Zog I, it is happening now. The national religion is, for all intents and purposes, Albanianism. There is a mosque under construction in Tirana built with funds from the Turkish Republic. I haven't met anyone that has a positive opinion about that. Most people I asked around about it either didn't care or had a skeptical view because the mosque is not Albanian and thus problematic. This skepticism of foreign powers interfering in the national religious landscape sometimes ends up making tabloid headlines, like it happened in 2015 when the locals called the police claiming ISIS is doing a propaganda video on the outskirts of Tirana. The propaganda video was actually a music video by the Albanian singer Ronela Hayati, and it was an Aladdin-themed video. Nothing really to do even marginally with Islam, let alone any terrorist activity. Nevertheless, this skepticism is something that should be cultivated, as it paid dividends both to the country and its neighbors when the Saudi or Qatari-funded Wahhabis tried to infiltrate and subvert, only to end up being roundly rejected and many of them deported, prosecuted or deferred to international authorities. This skepticism of the local population to anyone from the outside who tries to come and tell them how they should do God correctly seems to come almost naturally to Albanians, and it acts as a fantastic bulwark against many dangers such as Erdogan's neo-Ottomanist aspirations and Wahhabi subversion. Once again, the comparison with Bosnia is warranted. While the Bosnian Muslims are also quite chill, their lack of skepticism allowed Qatari-funded extremists to establish quite a stronghold in Bosnia and will continue to be a geopolitical problem in the coming years. The Albanians are having none of that in their lands. Now, I mentioned a few times that we shouldn't totally trust the modern census on the religious landscape of the country, and it's true in many other countries as well. The census has become less and less accurate, partly, and again this is true in most of Europe, because the census methods are unchanged since the 1800s, when the population was a lot more stable. As a result, the 2011 Albanian census missed significant portions of the population because they couldn't be found at their official addresses, or because they lived in areas that the government still doesn't know those areas are even inhabited. And yeah, that's a thing in Albania too. On top of everything I mentioned so far, there's also the Kanun of Leke Dugajini, which is a set of traditional Albanian laws that predate most of the things we talked about in this video. While the Kanun was first written in the 15th century by Leke Dugajini, the set of laws had been around for much longer than that, with Leke merely writing them down. The collection has also been gradually brought back to life in the post-communist period. While I will eventually make a video specifically on this, for now I will only say that the Kanun is largely responsible for the Albanians' distinct lack of anti-Semitism, but also responsible for the relatively famous blood feuds about which many documentaries have been made, and even made it into the pop culture. And as usual with the pop culture, they got the details wrong. But anyway, that's a story for another day. So, let's get to the final point, conclusions. There's really one conclusion in light of the facts. Albania is not like any other Muslim country, because Albania is not a Muslim country. In terms of relevance, Islam doesn't even make the top 3 concerns for the vast majority of the population, regardless of how those individuals might identify themselves as. Albanianism, the 4 pillars of the Kanun, which are honor, hospitality, righteous conduct, and kin loyalty, as well as economics, all these rank much higher than Islam for almost all Albanians, regardless of whether they even recognize the Kanun or not. No matter how you look at things, other than occasional Ottomanish architecture and some loanwords here and there in the Albanian language, this country has very little to do with any other quote-unquote Muslim country. On top of that, you also have quite a strong segment of the society that regards both Islam and Christianity as something forced upon Albania with no local input, and that's the segment that is successfully pushing for total indifference on the topic. In other words, the Albanians are having an outcome of religious tolerance precisely because they don't talk about it and don't care about it. The opposite of the affirmative action type of tolerance that the Western leftists are promoting. The footage, in my view, speaks for itself which version works and which version absolutely does not work. In Albania, there are a few things you should never joke about: the Albanian flag, the map of Albania, the Albanian language, and Skanderberg. Never, and I mean never, joke about these things. Seriously, just don't. Otherwise, everything else is fair game, and I mean everything. I've heard some awesome anti-Islamic jokes from a man named Muhammad who served me pork steak while there was a call to prayer. There ain't that many countries in the world where you can experience something like that. So, I asked at the beginning of this video, what makes Albania different? And the answer is nothing. We're just looking at it from an absolutely wrong angle. One should not look at Albania as a quote-unquote Muslim country, but rather as a country that also has some Muslims in it, just like Ukraine or Bulgaria has some Muslims in it. No matter how much one tries, there simply isn't a way to look at Albania as a Muslim country. In fact, for a Muslim hardliner, a walk in Tirana is a nightmare. The outskirts of Stockholm are far more Islamic than Tirana is or was in the last 100 years. Footage from the 1930s Tirana still show a place that is many things: poor, tormented, modernizing, increasingly disciplined, nice, and many other things, but not Islamic. In fact, in some circles, Albanians, including Albanian Muslims, are quite infuriated if you call them a Muslim country. This happens quite often when Western leftists try to be nice and laud the situation in Albania whilst not understanding anything about how and why Albania functions. Also, don't call them progressive. They won't helicopter you, but the Kanun has quite detailed specifications on what is to be done with people who insult them so deeply. So, in conclusion, religion in Albania is a lot more of a complex matter than statistics would show at a first glance, but complex in a good way, because this kind of setup appears to be very resistant to both Wahhabi and Western leftist subversion, which is great since both of these dangers have wreaked havoc in other European societies. What is missing here is morale. A significant chunk of Albanians are demoralized in the Soviet sense. That will have to be fixed, but that's also a story for another day. So this concludes the first featured installment of the 2018 Albania tour. I don't know how many installments will be, but I do know that there are a lot more stories to be told from this country, and we'll try to tell as many of them as possible here on the Freedom Alternative. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do subscribe to my social media, and if you derive any value from the work being done here, please do consider throwing a shekel as well. And with that, I will see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.